The decision yesterday by the Ukrainian government, led by Mykola Azarov, to issue a resolution cancelling or halting preparations for the association agreement came as a shock to most people because it was so abrupt and came out of the blue. After all, there was still another week to go before the Vilnius summit of the Eastern Partnership in 28th and 29th of this month. And so they could have had another week to potentially seek a compromise. So something happened for them to decide to break the negotiations off now. And there are probably a number of factors here. Firstly, let me lay out my own cards. I was always quite skeptical. I was in the minority of people who were quite skeptical that President Yanukovych would agree to release Yulia Tymoshenko. The majority opinion, businessmen I've talked to, and Ukrainian diaspora people, and also academics and scholars, believe that the deal was such a good one for Ukraine, European integration, that the rationale, the logic would be that he would strike a compromise, send it to Germany for medical treatment, and then in the end it'd come out as the statesman signing the association agreement. There was also, I think, a strong opinion amongst quite a few people in the Ukrainian diaspora, certainly amongst many Ukrainian experts in Ukraine, and it was certainly the opinion of Viktor Yanukovych that Ukraine is so geopolitically important that the European Union cannot say no to Ukraine. And I think this was a mistaken viewpoint, and I believe that what happened was that President Yanukovych, up until a few days ago, maybe a week ago, really did believe that the European Union was bluffing, that it would have signed the association agreement in Vilnius even if Tymoshenko had not been released, even if she was still in jail. What became clear to him and his administration was that in the last week that was not going to be the case. And so he had to change his mind. He had to think up a new strategy. And this was a consequence of EU piling on pressure, saying that there's going to be no deal in Vilnius unless Tymoshenko is released. Also, the US Senate this week issued a strongly worded resolution demanding that Yulia Tymoshenko be released. So all of these factors meant that he had to change his mind. He believed he could get away with it, he could have his cake and eat it, get the association agreement without actually doing the work. And at the same time as actually doing undemocratic steps, such as trying to prevent Vitali Klitschko from standing in 2015, from launching a criminal case against Yulia Tymoshenko's lawyer, alleging that he had beaten his ex-wife, and so on and so on. But in the end, they understood that the EU was serious about human rights questions, and hence there were lots of stalling tactics this week. The party regions, which cannot do anything in the Ukrainian parliament without the authorization of both the Prime Minister, who was the leader of the party, and the President, who used to be the former leader, began to stall and began to find ways not to reach a compromise. The most ludicrous aspect of this was the another new charge, criminal charge. There's probably been now already over 10 against Tymoshenko. A new one surfaced about 2 weeks ago, which alleged that Tymoshenko had money stashed abroad, and that there was they hired a British law firm to try to seek where this money would be deposited. Well, first of all, every Ukrainian member of the elites has money stashed abroad, and that's not a secret. One has only to travel and walk around London to know that the reason why it's nicknamed Londongrad, or Moscow on the Thames. The Ukrainian oligarchs send huge amounts of money. We're talking billions of dollars each year to places such as Cyprus, that's why it's the biggest foreign investor in Ukraine, to Monaco, to Liechtenstein, to Belize, Virgin Islands, and of course to Western Europe. So the idea that Tymoshenko was unusual here, if she had some money stashed abroad, which is certainly possible from the 1990s, would be rather ludicrous. And it was obviously a stalling tactic against her. And then it was obviously also not a serious step in the light of trying to reach a compromise over her fate. And the compromise was potentially there. All that Viktor Yanukovych had to do was to pardon her in the same sense that he pardoned Yulia Tymoshenko in April of this year. She would have gone to Germany for medical treatment, and that would have been the end of it. The stalling problem was the unwillingness on the part of the Yanukovych administration to annul the criminal charges that they had piled up against Yulia Tymoshenko. So therefore it would have been a rather ludicrous situation, for example, if Tymoshenko had gone to Germany for medical treatment, still with criminal charges hanging over her head. They'd have signed the association agreement, and then Tymoshenko may have returned to Ukraine after medical treatment, and then the association agreement would have been suspended. So that was a non-starter. So they had to deal with the question of her criminal charges, which of course Europe, Canada and the US describe as selective use of justice. And they were blatantly unwilling to do that. At the bottom of this lies a number of factors, I think. The first thing that we should understand, and this was something that I found was rather strange amongst Western policymakers, in the sense of they couldn't get their heads around who was Viktor Yanukovych. And this was the question of what was he really interested in? Well, Viktor Yanukovych is neither pro-Russian or pro-European. He's pro-Yanukovych. That's his foreign policy. He's not interested in the national interest of Ukraine. He's not interested in the Ukrainian population. He's interested in his own personal gain. That's it. And the gain of the people around him. So what would be lucrative for him, going either east or going west? It's not a question of an ideological commitment to Europe in the sense of, say, Eastern Europeans or the Baltic peoples in the 1990s who desired to return to Europe and thereby escape from their communist past and escape from Russia's sphere of influence. That was not something in Yanukovych's mindset. In today's Ukrainska Pravda, Serhiy Leshchenko, who is one of the best journalists in Ukraine, writes a very good blog which he's entitled Yanukovych Declares War. And in that he goes into the details of how it was always a mistake to assume that Yanukovych had an ideological commitment to European integration. So that's one factor. Second factor was that he is paranoid about Yulia Tymoshenko, and in the light of that, his priority is not European integration, his priority is staying in power. And if staying in power means not having an association agreement, because that requires releasing Tymoshenko, then he chooses staying in power. And his priority is becoming re-elected in 2015, not in European integration. And he was always afraid that Tymoshenko, even though she might be based in Germany, would somehow ignite and mobilize the population behind the opposition. And that was something that he's always been paranoid about with relation to Tymoshenko, because she is a very good organizer and a very good mobilizer and a very good orator. And that factor played in as well into his calculations as to whether it would be a good idea. He even asked the ludicrous question of the Germans whether they could put her under kind of wraps, as it were, that when she was in Germany she wouldn't be able to undertake political work. He obviously didn't understand how a Western democracy worked. How would a Western democracy, Canada, Germany, Britain, be able to sort of prevent somebody undertaking medical treatment from taking press interviews? That would be absolutely impossible. And in a globalized world with the internet and with Facebook and with Skype, it's very possible for Tymoshenko to be actually on the stage at a rally in Ukraine, but still be based in Germany. So that factor also worked into his calculations. I think we should also look at the fact that the European Union badly mismanaged the whole process. The European Union kept, and this is probably understandable in the sense of the European Union is 28 countries, different foreign ministers of those EU member states make statements at different times, which often sometimes contradict what the EU position is. The EU position kept changing the goalposts, it kept changing the deadlines. And this was music to Yanukovych's ears. It made him really did believe that the European Union was bluffing. For example, a few weeks ago, Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, said, well, if we don't resolve this question by Vilnius, we can always do it in 2014. Or the Polish president, also said about a week ago that if we don't resolve everything which is required by Vilnius, then we can finish resolving it in 2014. It doesn't really matter. These kind of signals sent the wrong message to President Yanukovych, believing that the EU wasn't really serious about its demands, it wasn't really serious about its deadlines. Secondly, the European Union did not use its strongest card, and its strongest card is what I've already mentioned, that all the bank accounts of Ukraine's elites are based in Western Europe and based in offshore zones of Western European countries, such as the Virgin Islands or Belize, for example. And therefore the EU had a fantastic lever with which to pressure the Ukrainian elites, which it never really used, or never wanted to use, maybe because of its own personal gain and interest from having that money flow into Western Europe. But certainly, if, for example, EU officials had sat down, and the Kwasniewski Commission had sat down with President Yanukovych and his colleagues, and the EU officials had pulled out of their bags big files with all the bank account details of Ukrainian officials and said, these will be under threat if you don't play ball. I think the situation would have been far different in terms of negotiating style and negotiating power of the European Union vis-a-vis Yanukovych. But that wasn't something that happened. The final question that we have to now look at is, where do we go from here? I don't think Yanukovych is going to quickly sign and join the CIS customs union. He certainly has obviously got some kind of deal with President Putin, and that deal must include something along the lines of a revision of the gas contract from 2009, which the Yanukovych authorities have always sought to receive, and maybe a gas consortium between Russia and Ukraine over Ukraine's gas pipelines. A third factor which Yanukovych certainly will be after and probably received is Vladimir Putin's support for his re-election in 2015. After all, Yanukovych will be the guarantee of Russia's interests in Ukraine, and if he is removed from power, then the opposition certainly will annul many of the policies that Viktor Yanukovych has signed up to. For example, the Kharkiv Accords on the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, or a gas consortium, or the question of NATO membership, say. So that is the kind of bargain that's certainly happening behind the scenes. Serhiy Leshchenko, in his blog today, claimed, and I think it's probably correct, that the resolution came out so abruptly yesterday from the government because it was Russia's demand that Yanukovych was telling the truth, because they also don't trust him. And they wanted to make sure that he ended any prospects of European integration, otherwise they wouldn't be willing to agree to some of the demands or some of the requests that he was making on their side. Come the 2015 presidential elections, which is only about 15-16 months away, I think that Yanukovych will probably have no choice but to use the question of joining the CIS customs union as a way to try and mobilize his very disgruntled and disaffected voters in eastern Ukraine, because he hasn't really got much else to mobilize people on. He's trying now to mobilize people on the question of anti-fascism, which is describing the opposition in terms of people with links to fascist, so-called fascist structures, a recourse to the old Soviet ideology of anti-bourgeois nationalism, but a policy of trying to mobilize voters using a very divisive issues such as a CIS customs union will be highly dangerous for Ukraine. For patriotic Ukrainians, regardless of whether they are anywhere in Ukraine, the CIS customs union, which is a precursor to Vladimir Putin's Eurasian Union, is the equivalent of reviving the USSR. And so hence this will be something that will be highly detrimental to national unity, which is already very bad. And secondly, we have another dangerous component thrown into the equation, which is why Serhiy Leshchenko described his blog as Yanukovych Declares War. And that is because for Yanukovych, it would have been actually better to sign the association agreement with the EU, because then if he'd have, for example, lost the elections in 2015, he could have got the EU to ensure that his that he received some kind of immunity from prosecution, and that maybe he could keep what he's actually accumulated during his presidency. But with that now no longer on the cards, then he is going to be absolutely paranoid about leaving office, because there are going to be many people, not only Tymoshenko, who will be demanding that he be put to criminal charges for a whole range of issues, including, in the case of Yatsenyuk, has already talked about treason. And so the unwillingness to leave office, or the fear of leaving office, and the kind of innate demand that he should have the right to a second term in office, plus the fact that he has to use very divisive issues to mobilize his voters, is going to lead, again, as Leshchenko writes in his blog today, to, I think, an election campaign in 2015, which will be worse in terms of election fraud and in terms of conflict than what happened in 2004. So it's not something that's going to be a very bright future. One hopes that Arsenij Yatsenyuk and Vitali Klitschko and even Oleg Tyanobok are able to mobilize Ukrainians to try and prevent these steps being taken, and to try and mobilize them for an opposition victory, which would then reopen the question of the association agreement with the EU. But that is something to be seen. Ukrainians are still very disillusioned from what happened in the Orange Revolution, and neither Vitali Klitschko or Arsenij Yatsenyuk are very good orators and not very charismatic, unlike, say, Oleg Tyanobok or Yulia Tymoshenko. So it's a big question mark. This Sunday, there's a planned protest in Kyiv. I believe that if they don't have at a minimum 100,000 people, then it should be classified as a failure. Moldova, next door, a country with a minute population compared to Ukraine, managed to mobilize 100,000 people on the streets of Chisinau in support of European integration. If they can do it, Ukrainians should be able to do it. But we shall see. And certainly it'll be anything under 100,000 will be seen by Yanukovych as well as something that he shouldn't be really afraid of. But we are going to be now moving into very dangerous times. Thank you.